Last week, the House Republicans passed the one big beautiful bill, baby. It now moves over to the Senate, where, of course, as we all know, good legislation goes to die, and they will slash, hack, let the lobbyists take a go at it, take a big old bite out of it, change it, and send it back to the House, where ultimately they will fight and destroy each other trying to, ratify it. So we are in for an entertaining 2 weeks, especially if you're one that reads your political news, because you'll hear about all the shouting matches that these blue state Republicans got into and da 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 da. Should be fun. But what's in the bill? So there's some speculation under this. So I'm sure you saw Thomas Massey got into it with the White House about whether or not this bill adds to the deficit. Did you know Caroline Leavitt and the White House claims that this is deficit neutral?
Well, that's just ridiculous after hearing what's in it, but I'll let you go on.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and I'll play the clip with Thomas Massey and Caroline.
When the White House says this will not raise the deficit, what do you say to them?
Nobody says that.
The White House said
Who
that.
is saying
The White House said that.
Is the president okay with this bill adding to the deficit?
This bill does not add to the deficit.
I mean, over here, the people in favor of this bill say that under the policies of this bill, we're going to add $20 trillion to debt over the next 10 years, which is $3.5 to $5 trillion more than would have been added otherwise. And that's just a fact.
So they're not.
I mean, that's under rosy assumptions.
Yeah, they're saying it's deficit neutral.
No, that's a joke.
Yeah, so as Massey said, the people who wrote and voted for this bill are arguing that under the best case scenario, this is going to add at least 2.5 trillion to the deficit, like minimum 2.5 trillion. The Senate is doing their projections, and the Senate is weird. They do it bipartisanly, which that just makes too much fucking sense. And so their projections are almost $5.25 trillion.
Yeah.
So obviously, Rand Paul comes out against this, and I'll go ahead and I'll play that clip too.
The bigger a bill, the more it includes, the more difficult it is to get everybody to agree to things. I supported the tax cuts in 2017. I support making them permanent, so I support that part of the bill. I support spending cuts. I think the cuts currently in the bill are wimpy and anemic, but I still would support the bill, even with wimpy and anemic cuts, if they weren't going to explode the debt. The problem is the math doesn't add up. They're going to explode the debt by, the House says $4 trillion. The Senate's actually been talking about exploding the debt $5 trillion. This year in September, when our fiscal year ends, the deficit will be about $2.2 trillion. Now, people used to always say, the Republicans would say, what's Bidenomics? That's Biden spending levels. When March, every Republican, virtually every Republican other than me, voted to continue the Biden spending levels, which are going to give us a $2.2 trillion deficit. Now, if you increase the debt ceiling $4 to $5 trillion, that means they're planning on $2 trillion this year and more than $2 trillion next year. That's just not conservative. So I've told them if they strip out the debt ceiling, I'll consider, even with the imperfections, voting for the rest of the bill. But I can't vote to raise the debt ceiling $5 trillion. There's got to be someone left in Washington who thinks debt is wrong and deficits are wrong and wants to go in the other direction. The idea that we're going to explode deficits, and the projections are now looking at over $3 trillion in deficits over the next 10 years, I think is just, not a serious proposal.
Where, basically, you get some of the stuff you like, right, Darren? You get the tax cuts, the standard deduction that everybody gets, or actually that 99% of people get, it increases. Child tax credit increases. You do get, if the bill passes, no tax on overtime, car loan, interest, tips, all that, and increased defense spending. But, there are some pretty big cuts. I don't know if you've heard. The student loan changes are going to be pretty dramatic for anyone who isn't caught up. He's going to rescind significant portions of the Inflation Reduction Act. And, of course, the one that everyone is arguing about, and where I bet we're going to spend most of our time talking about, Medicaid cuts. At a 10-year horizon, which is how they time out all there bills, you got anywhere from about a $3 trillion deficit to a $5 trillion deficit. So, what are your thoughts? Is there anything you've heard that I didn't cover, or what are your initial thoughts?
You hit on all the big things. Basically, it's all pretty bad because he wants to do he basically wants to get that, from his first term, he wants the tax cuts, the corporate tax cut, and the standard deduction that had the increase in that. He wants to bring that back, and well, just last week, we got our rating got downgraded by a Moody's because our ability to pay off our debts is looking less and less plausible. And so if we're going to be bringing less revenue in, it just doesn't make any sense. Ultimately we need to be taxed more, unfortunately. And as much as I liked the Trump tax cut, because it does put a little more money in your pocket come tax season, but it's really not worth like not being able to pay off the national debt. And I get that they're like afraid of like war with Iran and China, but we really can't afford to be spending all this much money on the they want $1 trillion yearly military budget. It's like, that's just ridiculous. And I don't know, it's pretty much all bad. And they want to like slash Medicaid to get all this, to make it like budget neutral or whatever, because this is like they're doing this thing called budget reconciliation. Like that's what how they're doing all this. And basically the deal with that is it has to not it can't increase the deficit. Like it has to rather cut spending, or it has to bring in revenues, something along those lines. But I just fail to see how this bill could possibly do that without them like
Well, it's not.
basically fudging the numbers. So
Yeah, it's definitely not, and I'll tell you why. They're raising the debt ceiling. Why would you raise the debt ceiling if you thought that at the end of the year that we were going to be budget neutral?
oh yeah, exactly. I mean, it's just ridiculous, and it's just not what we need right now. And honestly, I'm not happy about about it at all. I mean, I don't know if there's really anything good about it. I like that there's proposed, they're gonna put like a lot of money in for the border and ICE, but ultimately, when push comes to shove and when they need to whittle this bill down, that's going to be the first stuff on the chopping block.
Right.
So, we're probably going to get another corporate tax cut, and there's probably going to be some other stuff that I don't, the military, increased military spending, which we don't need right now. So ultimately, it's just going to be a terrible bill, and whenever its final form is manifested. So I don't know if there's really anything all that positive about it.
Yeah, and listen, let me just go ahead and steel man it. So Mike Johnson had a pretty good clip with Jake Tapper, and I'll just go ahead and play that.
So there are 5 different independent scores of this legislation. Every one of them says that it will increase the deficit somewhere between $3.3 and $4 trillion over the next 10 years. Now, I get you take issue with the Congressional Budget Office and that they don't have dynamic scoring, all this. But this is the emerging consensus among everyone analyzing. They say you're kicking, not only are you kicking the can down the road, but you're making the problem worse. You're adding to the debt.
Well, I think that is dramatically overstated, and here's why. Those same groups can objectively see and acknowledge that this is the largest cut in spending in at least 30 years and arguably of all time. We're cutting over $1.5 trillion in federal spending while we check all the boxes and bring about a pro-growth economy. And the CBO has been panned because, as you said, they don't do dynamic scoring. What that means is they don't account for the growth that will be fostered by by all the policies that are in this this big piece of legislation. This is not theoretical, Jake. Just remember the last Trump administration. After the first 2 years, we brought about the greatest economy in the history of the world, not just the U.S. The growth was off the charts. It was an average of about 3% of growth in GDP. Why? Because we cut taxes and we cut regulations. We're doing the same thing this time around, but on steroids. This is a much larger package, a much more robust package with all these features that will really get the economy going, because wages will rise, job creators, entrepreneurs, risk takers will have more ability to expand their businesses. U.S. manufacturing onshore is being incentivized. All these things will work together to make the economy grow faster than many of these projections are putting forth. So we're not buying it. We'll see what happens, and we have the evidence to prove it from the past.
Basically, the argument is, hey, look, if GDP goes up and up and up, if we grow 3%, 4% in GDP, which, by the way, would be nuts if we grew that much.
Yeah, that would be
that's
crazy.
unbearable. We may be GDP flat for 2025, to be honest with you. But let's assume that he's right. If GDP increases and the tax rate stays the same and the spending stays the same, then obviously your tax revenue is going to increase, right? Because it's a percentage of your GDP, right? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So his argument is that we can grow our way out of this deficit. And he got really pissed in that clip where basically he's like, well, they don't account for growth. And it's like, because we're not going to fucking grow, Mike. Like, it doesn't make any sense that he's saying, what, we can grow 3, 4, whatever number percent we need to grow to justify these tax cuts. Because, I mean, this is at the point where, like, Rand Paul and Thomas Massey can't support it. And listen, they're deficit hawks, but also, like, nobody wants a tax cut more than those guys. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah.
And the part that shakes it for me, Darren, is so, like, at least when Biden was blowing out the deficit, it was like, okay, we at least got, plans and funding for bridges, roads, chips, centers, we got tangible assets out of it, right? What is the tangible asset that we're going to get out of this? It's really nothing. I mean, you're going to end up. So I'm going to put up a little picture right now on screen for the viewers to see. But basically, you're talking maximum. If you're the bottom 60% of this country, you're not going to see any material benefit at all. Once you take into account, like, your Medicaid and your SNAP cuts, right? So, I mean, we're all getting screwed here. The only people that are making out like a bandit is the top 40%, or specifically the top, 10% of the country. And like I said, for what? Like, what is the sell here? I don't understand what we're supposed to take. I mean, every person alive from every political ideology has something about this bill that they hate and they can't stand. So that's why we should get rid of it. We should just not even entertain it.
Yeah, ultimately, I honestly, it should all just be scrapped and reworked. But I mean, I don't think that's going to happen. I think ultimately we're going to get something fairly unsavory by the end of it all, and hopefully they can, hopefully in the next couple of weeks that they can whittle it down and mitigate the damage it'll do. But yeah, I mean, right now is not the time for tax cuts. It's the time for tax increases. So
yeah, I couldn't agree more. They're saying that potentially almost, 8 to 9 million Americans are going to lose health insurance if this bill passes. So to kind of put that into perspective, that doesn't sound like a lot, right? You're like, it's a country of almost 400 million people, right? Like, what's the big deal? That would work back the clock 10 years in terms of the number of Americans that are uninsured. That's going to roll back the clock a decade. So, obviously it's not good in terms of, like, if you're poor and don't have health insurance. So, and this, I don't know if you've paid attention much, but there's this dumb idea that people on Medicaid are just mooching off the the government. They're basically living on a private yacht, but they need Medicaid is the way they make it sound.
No, they're pretty destitute for the most part. Yeah, they don't. If you're on Medicaid, yeah, you don't have much going for you. That's for sure. So
Right. And
you're certainly not in the upper echelon.
right. It's none of this makes any sense. I mean, whether you're like a 19-year-old college student who doesn't have a job because you're going to school, or maybe you have a job and maybe you just have a job and it doesn't have health insurance, then like what are you supposed to do? You know, I guess you're
Oh
just
yeah.
supposed to figure it out. Same old, same old. But um, the fact is that like yes, you are getting a tax cut. We are getting some spending cuts, but it's still going to add tremendously to the deficit. What probably at some point over Trump's 4 years, we're going to reach as a percentage of GDP, our debt will reach over 100% of GDP at some point.
Yeah.
The interest on our debt alone is going to be more than our military budget. Think about that. And they're trying to sell our bonds. That's why you saw our bond rating, as you mentioned it, went from AAA to AA1, which
Hmm.
basically means that from now on, when we have to borrow money, when we have to deficit spend, that the interest on that bond is going to be like significantly higher. So like rather than being like a 2% or a 3% bond, it's going to be like a 5% or 6%. So this is only going to be exponentially harder, and it's like nobody cares in Washington because they're old and they're all about to die. Some of them literally are dying, like these Democrats, literally dying in office.
Well, that's why the bill passed in the House because
Yeah,
I think a
yeah.
Democrat died off, and then he couldn't tie the vote. So I forgot his name.
Democrat in Texas, yeah, Democrat in Texas died.
Yeah, but they'll oust David Hogg for pointing it out.
Oh,
Did you see that? I don't know if you
yeah,
saw.
I did see that. That's I also saw him on Bill Maher too, or is that where it was?
Yeah, that's what spurred
Yes,
it because
yeah.
he had this little monologue where he was like, you know, basically out with the old and with the new, and it pissed off the elders, I guess, and they got rid of him. So
Oh, he's no longer the vice chair?
I don't think so. I think he's no longer in that
No
position.
kidding. I did not see that. That I did not see. That's if that's true, that's unbelievable, actually. Because he's right. I mean, we need new blood. And I'm not even the biggest David Hogg fan. Like, but he's absolutely right.
Let me make sure I have that right because that's the headline I saw.
I mean, maybe there's
Oh, there's
pressure.
a move to potentially oust David Hogg from his
Okay.
position.
I
So
was
he is
literally
not. Yeah,
about to
okay.
say, I was like,
Okay.
he just won that thing too. That's not. But anyway, regardless, I appreciate you fact checking us
Yeah, I,
live.
I, I, I blame clickbait because I read headlines and I don't. That's
Right.
my problem. I'll read the headline and I'll be like, oh my gosh. And
Yeah.
yeah, I should have read further into. Okay, but he has not yet been ousted, but he did piss off the old folks. So
It is worth mentioning too, and then I'll give you the last words and, then we can move on to our last topic if you want. But Biden's proposal this year, basically his idea was that if you make over $500,000, we're going to remove your tax cut, right? So now you're going to pay a higher tax, and that would roughly fund $1.1 trillion over the next 10 years, which is also enough to fund Medicaid and SNAP just by themselves. So, like, that would add basically an extra $1 trillion in surplus over the next 10 years. And instead of doing that, they're deciding they're going to add anywhere from 3 to 5 trillion. So, should be fun.
responsible governance.
Hmm. Any final
Uh,
thoughts before we move on?
oh, I think that's all I have to say on the matter.
Okay, and this one will be more shooting the shit and BSing, but I just had to get your take.